Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the second of our three-part summer storm series. My name is Andrea Berg, and I'm your host today. And I am joined by my colleague Nick Wilson, who will be going through a Hurricane Ian case study. Very timely with a hurricane going on right now in Florida. So we're going to go take a look at outage predictions and Hurricane Ian. So I'm going to turn this over to Nick.
I appreciate the introduction, Andrea, and we couldn't have scripted it any better. We scheduled this summer webinar series a number of weeks ago, and here we are today on August 30th with, lo and behold, the landfall of yet another I-named hurricane, in this case, Idalia today. With those current events on our mind, I'm going to spend the first half of the webinar today going through an overview of the Hurricane Ian case study, and then I'll save some time here at the end to provide an overview as far as what the predictions look like for Idalia prior to landfall earlier today, and provide a little bit of perspective about what's going to happen over the course of the next 24 hours. So with that, we'll jump right in. So as an introduction, my name is Nick Wilson. I'm DTN's Director of Product Management for Weather and Climate Risk. I'm based out of DTN's headquarters in the Minneapolis area. I've been working in and around the intersection of weather risk and the private sector, working in and around utility applications, aviation, transportation, and business continuity for more than 20 years. So today we're going to take a look at some of the meteorological background and impacts associated with Hurricane Ian, which is still to this day, and I'd expect, despite the impacts of Idalia, will remain the most costly hurricane that's ever made landfall into Florida. So let's take a look at Hurricane Ian. So it made landfall about 4 weeks from now on September 28th of 2022. In southwestern Florida. So the track of Ian actually was further south, which put a lot greater population under impact and resulting catastrophe from the storm. As it's then carried on across central and northern Florida. As it made landfall, it had maximum sustained winds that were around 150 miles per hour. Idalia earlier today, I think officially the sustained winds were 125 miles per hour. So Ian was classified as a Category 4 relative to a Category 3 for Idalia. And as we'll talk about later, Idalia has certainly weakened pretty significantly as it made landfall, whereas Ian certainly held a stronger punch as it moved across the Florida peninsula. On the evening of September 28th, more than 2 million customers were without power, and mandatory curfews were issued for the communities along the Florida's west coast. And as I'll share a little bit later, more than 2 million people were evacuated in advance of the landfall of the storm. It was responsible for 150 direct and indirect deaths, and as mentioned, it was the most costliest hurricane in Florida history, with an estimate of the economic impact of $112 billion, and the third costliest United States hurricane in history. Before we go into a little bit more detail about Hurricane Ian, I wanted to talk through what are some of the typical impacts that electric utilities we'll see associated with the forecast and ultimate impact of hurricanes. We'll talk a little bit here. Florida Power and Light, which is the largest electric utility serving customers in Florida, they're estimated from Hurricane Ian, according to some of their financial disclosures from late last year, that they estimated that Hurricane Ian cost their customers $1.1 billion collectively in the labor that was needed in order to restore service and repair the damage, as well as the associated hardware and equipment involved with those repairs. So some of the problems that an electric utility can see from the impacts of hurricanes is, the thing that's first notable is electricity distribution. So damage to the power lines and power poles that are that last mile of delivery of electricity to your home or business. The long duration sustained winds, and wind gusts, not guts, can topple vegetation, poles and lines, leading to widespread outages. Amazingly enough, with Hurricane Ian, Florida Power and Light did not lose a single transmission pole or tower, but I'd say that is certainly an anomaly relative to the impacts of most storms. That probably goes to show that a lot of the resiliency investments that FP&L have been making are resulting in some greater benefits, albeit the most significant impacts of landfall were concentrated to a few cooperative electric utilities around the Fort Myers and Naples area, and I can assure you that they had much more significant damage. Additionally, the landfall of hurricanes can lead to damage to power plants. If you have coastal power plant assets, storm surge can inundate those, as well as substations that may be co-located. Additionally, then the high winds can also bring down cooling towers or buildings that are housing and associated with the power plant equipment. FP&L, another interesting stat that you also maybe don't think about is there's a lot of renewable energy installation in the southern United States, most notably solar photovoltaic panels. And FP&L had 12 million solar panels across Florida, and less than 0.5% of those were destroyed during the hurricane. So, really, I think the benefits of distributed energy is that it may not have the catastrophic effects as if a hurricane were bearing down on, say, a large coal, fossil fuel, or nuclear power plant that would be providing a substantial amount of the electricity for a major metropolitan area. Evacuations are also of interest and concern to the utilities. In the case of Ian, 2.5 million people were ordered to be evacuated before the landfall of the storm. It's really common that with that amount of evacuations, it then makes it really difficult for utility crews to access damaged equipment at people's homes and restore power. But at the same time, it's also a great safety hazard to those that would live in and around the damage. So it really goes both ways. Then lastly, on the business disruption front, the aftermath of a significant landfalling hurricane leads to communities that, with those evacuations, people are dispersed. They can't return to their home if they don't have power, if there's significant damage for weeks, months, even years at a time. And that ultimately leads to challenges for local businesses that need to shutter. It also ultimately diminishes electricity usage in and around the community and lowers the revenues for the utility. It certainly, I think, was a pretty good success story. In FP&L's case, they restored service completely for their customers within 8 days and had 2/3 of their customers back on after day one. However, as we know, some of the most catastrophic damage, as mentioned, further down the coast in Florida. It's certainly taken weeks, months in order to get that infrastructure up and ready, and even understanding given insurance claims and other downstream financial factors that need to come into play as far as when those places are going to be inhabited as they once were. So with Hurricane Ian, you can see that the track took itself, here through the lower western coast of Florida. The origins of Ian, it started off as most hurricanes do here in the fall season as a tropical wave that came off the west coast of Africa. It crossed the Atlantic, moved across the southeastern part of the Caribbean, and then started to turn northwest and became a hurricane past Grand Cayman, turned north across Cuba, and then entered the Gulf. And the warm waters and calm nature of the atmospheric winds allowed for pretty significant growth of the storm, as well as a large extent of the maximum winds, which is really a great measurable factor as far as what the ultimate impacts are. So related to the Big Bend up here area further north is where landfall occurred today with Idalia. So it's kind of skirted those impacted areas from Ian, thankfully. So DTN has an outage prediction system where we've built and trained a North American outage prediction model using 8 years of historic customers out data at a county level of granularity. That enabled us to, in the lead up to Hurricane Ian, provide large-scale outage prediction forecasts for the emergency management as well as the utility community in Florida. This shows a timeline of the number of new customers out across the storm event. So you can see that things were forecasted to ramp up with the landfall of the storm around 3 p.m. Eastern in the afternoon on the 28th, and then the subsequent impacts of the storm with peak outages on the 29th, and then tailing off with the outage impacts around September 1st. So ultimately, more than 43 hours in advance of landfall, DTN had predicted from September 27th to October 4th, the time window of the hurricane impacts, that nearly 4.6 million customers would lose power. At some point, obviously many customers multiple times during that window. And this ultimately came within 7% of the actual estimates, which are just shy of 4.3 million. Additionally, with the outage updates every 6 hours, you can dive into an even deeper level of granularity for immediate forecast and nowcasting of the impact of the hurricane. So when we took in aggregate every new 6-hour look forward forecast, the outage prediction was even honed in even further with just over 4.4 million, which was within 3% of the actual value. So, this demonstrates that the advancement of weather modeling as well as artificial intelligence and machine learning, given the accessibility to an increasing amount of utility data sets, is greatly improving our ability to forecast accurately the potential and realized impacts of landfalling hurricane events. This is a visual of what the forecasted outage predictions look like across that time window, where you could see, the darker shades, the lighter shades here of yellow, and the darker oranges here, the higher impact areas as far as an outage perspective. So you can see that things were concentrated along the coast as well as the subsequent aftermath as it moved across the Florida peninsula in and around the Orlando, Tampa, and upwards even of the Jacksonville area. The next slide then shows how the actual number of outages realized here. So this is the observed number of electricity customers that lost power. You can see that things were quite substantial along the western coast as forecasted, and ultimately, the impacts that were actually seen on the Atlantic side of the coast were accentuated as well as that were seen in the outage prediction model. So ultimately, what can utilities do to mitigate the potential risks for hurricanes? First and foremost, utilities that are leveraging and utilizing some of these advancements in artificial intelligence and machine learning to get quite accurate outage predictions, in upwards of 5 to 7 days in advance of a storm. They can understand the magnitude of the outages that are expected so that they can right-size the mobilization of their staff, foreign external contractors and crews that they need to bring in and pre-stage on site, along with activating the supply chain in order to get the equipment that they'll need in order to actually execute those repairs to accelerate restoration. Secondly, a tool that a lot of utilities are using are microgrids. So these are essentially, self-sustaining systems that can bring power generation to massively impacted areas much faster than traditional restoration. So these can be used to back up power and prioritize the restoration of mission critical facilities such as hospitals, police, and fire stations. And ultimately, if you get power back online, that helps minimize and reduce the damage elsewhere across their grid and infrastructure, since it's providing a localized and resilient source of power. Oftentimes you have issues with disrupted frequencies across the grid. There's a lot of downstream impacts when there's large-scale power outages associated with a hurricane. Lastly, then, grid resiliency investments. We talked about how FP&L didn't see any significant transmission structure impacts from Hurricane Ian. The utilities, especially in the southern United States, have been very proactive as far as investing in new infrastructure that can better cope with high winds and flooding. Additionally, there's considerations where possible and financially feasible to underground once overhead existing assets and moving those underground. Implementing stronger materials for poles and towers, and installation of installations that can withstand water intrusion. These are all contributing factors to lead to a more resilient utility in the face of potential tropical and hurricane storms. So with that, let's take a look at some of the forecast content around Hurricane Idalia and provide a little bit of an update as far as where we stand here as of 11:45 a.m. Central Time on August 30th. First and foremost, let's talk about the evolution of the forecast. These were forecasts from DTN's forecast engine, so roughly 48 hours ahead of landfall. I think in essence, as things sped up, it was about 40 hours in advance of landfall. The track of the storm was a little bit more southerly than what was realized. You could see that the stronger wind gusts here on the core of the eastern edge of the eye around Horseshoe Beach, where expected landfall was to occur around 11:30 a.m. With that forecast about 2 days in advance. Then yesterday evening, the forecast track had moved quite a bit further north. Previously Cedar Key was kind of in the sights. You could see that the larger wind field ended up missing that area and was further to the north. And ultimately, the landfall forecast was expected to be around 9:30 to 10 a.m. Last evening. But what was ultimately realized, it was a landfall this morning around 7:45 a.m. Eastern Time. So Idalia sped up significantly, and we'll show some of those factors that are going to change, maybe some of the expectations around the outage predictions here in a moment. This is then another visual 36 hours in advance from DTN Storm Risk Dashboard application with the extent of all of the marine and onshore high wind and severe thunderstorm and tornado warnings. One of the things you don't maybe often think about is, you have the concerns with the storm surge and the high wind damage, but with the swirling nature of a hurricane and the wind shear change in wind speed and direction with altitude, you can introduce a lot of tornado risks in the bands of the storms. So that's always an interesting factor that those that may be far away from the eye wall and the center of circulation need to be thinking about. And ultimately, I think it's difficult to read here, but some of the peak winds that were forecasted 36 to 48 hours in advance onshore were 90-mile-per-hour wind gusts. And I believe at least some of the official observations that I'd seen this morning from Perry, Florida, which was just inland from the site of landfall, the highest peak wind gust that was officially measured was 85 miles per hour. So really great capture of the expected wind impacts, nearly 2 days ahead. Now let's take a look at the outage predictions. So this was the forecast respectively for Wednesday. So August 30th as of Monday evening, and then Tuesday evening. So you can see some of the evolution with the expected outage impacts. The darker shades of orange are in excess of potentially 50,000 customers out per county. So you can see that there was a bit of an increase in the expected impact inland of the storm as it strengthened and sped up towards the Florida Peninsula. Ultimately, in Florida right now, the Tallahassee region that was highlighted as to be the most prone area for power outages has realized as such, but thankfully It stayed in the neighborhood of 30 to 35,000 customers impacted instead of the 50,000 that was potentially predicted. Another area to highlight is the impacts in and around with the more northerly track, as well as the weakening of intensity. The number of outages in and around the Tampa area has thankfully not materialized as significantly as predicted. However, storm surge was still prevalent across Clearwater Beach and other areas in the perimeter of Tampa. And I'm sure that there's quite significant property damage. Then this is the predictions for tomorrow. So this evening into Thursday. So you can see there's also been a forecasted step up in the level of intensity of the outage impacts stretching up into the Carolinas. So now, even this evening, as I think we'll see, it looks like around 7 or 8 p.m. Eastern time, Savannah, Georgia will be in the sights of the remnants of Idalia, and then it should move into the Charleston, South Carolina area with a lot of rain bands and high winds into the interior of the Carolinas. So that'll be a trend to watch. And this is imagery view at 7:45 a.m. Eastern time this morning, where landfall was official at Keaton Beach, Florida, as a Category 3 storm. So you can see, that coincides with the revised tracks that came out last evening. So the current situation, as of about a half hour ago, was there's roughly 270,000 customers out in Florida. It looked like they're finally trying to successfully burning down some of those outage counts. So it looks like the worst has passed in Florida, but there's certainly still a lot of rain bands and high winds in the northern part of the state that's going to continue to contribute to additional outages. Then, as we look forward, maybe take a look back is the Polk area was, Leon County, where Tallahassee resides, is the highest impact area, and then also some larger impacts in and around the Tampa metro, as well as further south along the coast, closer in those regions that Hurricane Ian had impacted. Then in Georgia, things are evolving pretty quickly here, but the Valdosta area in southern Georgia has seen the most significant impacts. In fact, the county down there is in excess of 50,000 customers out. That's Lowndes County. And so, ironically enough, it appears that maybe some of the most impactful results of the storm from Hurricane Idalia will actually be in Georgia for the utility industry at large. As you can imagine, there haven't been as significant of resiliency investments inland here, and there's certainly a lot of vegetation that can be problematic across much of the state of Georgia, which ends up impacting and falling on lines and causing outages. So it'll be interesting to see how things materialize this afternoon and evening as the storm continues to trek into the Carolina region, as there's certainly a lot of high populated areas along the coast as you go between Savannah and Charleston. So with that, I appreciate everyone's time and attention today. I think goes to show that we always need to be weather and climate aware as the frequency and severity of tropical storm and hurricane events continues to increase with climate change. But thankfully, there's a lot of tools and resources out there that utilities, emergency management, and other stakeholders can utilize in order to better prepare and prognose the impacts of these events so that they can keep people safe and restore electricity and business as usual as quickly as possible. There's my contact information. If anyone has any follow-up questions, you can send them to my email at nick.wilson@dtn.com, and I would welcome the opportunity to follow up with you. Wish everyone a safe rest of your Wednesday, August 30th afternoon, especially for those of you that are in the Southeast impacted by Hurricane Idalia. We'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us for our second installment of our Summer Storm series. I will be sending out the recording of this session. You should receive it either later this week or early next week. Our third and final Summer Storm series will be on high winds, and if you have not already registered for it, it will take place on Tuesday, September 12th at 9 a.m. Central Time. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.